Hello, guys. Welcome to Interior Analysis. I'm Angel Michelli,
I'm Evan Westman.
I'm Jelani T. Kelly.
and today we are talking about my first pick of all time of any movie ever, Drag Me to Hell, which is a movie that I really like. I watched this. Well, when was it? Last year. Actually, I know I watched it last year because it was in my top 10 new watches of last year because it was just like it felt very like classic horror comedy Raimi to me, like very much like Evil Dead. And it was something that at the time I was just really craving, and I didn't know why. And I'd never heard of this until I just like I think I happened upon it on like Stars or something, and it was such a good decision to watch it because wow, I really like this movie. I don't know how you guys feel about it, but I'd love to hear your initial thoughts too.
Yeah, so I can't say I super enjoyed this. We have a prolific history on this podcast between me and Jelani of not being a fan of Sam Raimi, which is mostly just, it's really just the Spider-Man trilogy.
It's just the Spider-Man.
Yeah, because the only other movie of his that I had seen aside from that was Duo-verse of Midness, which I also wasn't really a fan
yeah.
of, but I don't know if I even count that as a Sam Raimi movie because that's a Marvel product first and a Sam Raimi movie fourth.
It's a love-hate relationship we have because those movies are very memeable and quotable easily.
Yeah. There is a lot of fun that we've had discussing them in that love-hate way. But I think this did, and I'll save most of my thoughts on it for my topic, but I did remember why those movies don't work for me because I think a lot of the like macro large scale issues that Sam Raimi has in those are things that are showing up here too. There were just a few moments that I wanted to just shout out that don't fit with any topics. So many jump cuts and Dutch angles and so much Sam Raimi screaming women. Wow, is there a lot of it? There's a lot of it in the Spider-Man trilogy. There might be more of it here. Yusuf from Inception is in this. Diley Brow. That's a plus. I like him.
That's my guy. I love him.
Is he the psychic?
Yeah.
Yeah. Seriously underrated actor. Like,
He
I don't think I've
is.
seen a bad performance from him. And he's not in a lot of stuff either, at least not that I've seen, but like every time I see him I like him. I I don't know what it is. He's got like a presence.
I looked him up because I was like, yeah, what else is he in? He's only really in this Inception and then the first two Avatars. Apparently he's going to be in 4 and not 3. And then everything else on his filmography I didn't know. It's too bad because I think he's pretty good. I like him a lot as Yusuf. And I even like him in Avatar. And I like him in this too. You know, he's not spectacular, but I don't think anyone can be spectacular in this, hence my topic. But good to see him here. On another positive, I will acknowledge I think Sam Raimi does know what he's doing in terms of horror filmmaking, despite the stuff that we'll get into that I don't like about this. Like, some of his camera work, pretty good here. Like, I can tell that, like, he's kind of in his bag when he's doing horror stuff. And I felt that in, like, there's the couple of scenes in the Raimi trilogy, or the Spider-Man trilogy, that do kind of tend towards horror. And, like, you can feel that, like, this is
The Doc Ock hospital scene. That one.
mostly that.
Even as a
couple
kid.
of the Venom scenes, I think it feels a little bit like throwback, like it's kind of an 80s horror type of thing, but like he's doing it well, so I can't give him that. Okay, this moment was just nuts to me. There is a moment where she runs into the shed and an anvil falls on the demon's head like a Looney Tunes episode. I paused the movie when that happened. I was like, okay, what, no. Did that really just happen? Okay.
And then the eyes come out and shoot into her mouth.
It's, yeah. Well, and before that too, like the like preceding moment is the demon sticking her whole arm into her mouth.
Literally, that scene is what made me think up like my initial idea for my topic was like just how like I realized like this movie's disgusting. It's so gross. And like I will say this time there were elements of it that like didn't work for me as well as they did the first time just because like the shock had worn off and it was just gross.
I don't even know if I can call it shocking because the CGI in that scene is just so bad that like I can't even really engage with it like it's gross because I'm just like, okay, this is just like poor VFX. When like the eyes hit her face, it feels just so fake.
It looked like something out of like a movie that's trying to promote that it's like the 3D version of it. Like you remember that stretch of movies where it's like Jaws 3D, Saw 3D, Final Destination 3D. It felt like that type of thing for whatever
Piranha
reason.
Double D.
Ah, that.
Yeah.
Yeah. If it like even if it wasn't a literal anvil, it might have worked for me, but it just raises so like you only see that in cartoons. And like my letterboxd review for this is just why in the hell does she have an anvil in her shed?
Oh, I didn't even think of that. Why is there an anvil hanging from the ceiling?
That is a
Yes.
really good question.
What in this woman's incredibly generic 2009 life calls for her to have an anvil?
As a
And
loan officer.
also has like when she acquires this anvil, decides, I don't really have enough space in this shed. I'm gonna hang it up on a rope and not tie it actually that securely, and have it like it's only there to be just like it's just literal Looney Tunes. And I think Sam Raimi like seems to understand that and want that tone in that moment.
What about the initial scene? Like that was a whole fight scene in the car at the beginning
Yeah.
where she was scrapping with that lady for like a good, what felt like 10 minutes.
Yeah.
It does get kind of drawn out too, and it's like it's a little gnarly with like just using the stapler and stuff. Like
Yeah, and then that bar thing, she shoved it in her mouth and then she coughed it out and it.
I mean, Angel, I assume that's not to spoil your topic, but I assume we'll get into some of that there.
More along the Looney Tunes lines, where did the cinder block come from under her car?
That
Remember,
too.
she was just looking and
You
trying
know,
to find
I was
the
actually
lady.
wondering that this time. Like, where did she get just a giant brick or a cinder block? That's so weird. Yeah, and we will definitely get into that a little bit. My topic has shifted a little bit, and that scene doesn't factor into it as much, but I'll definitely touch on that because like the way that is executed definitely does make it. We'll get into it for sure. I don't know. I still like that scene. I thought that it got like that's when Sam Raimi's at his strongest is when he's allowed to get like super gnarly and stuff like that.
You're saying the car scene.
Which yeah, exactly. Like I thought that like it went further the first time I saw it, it's like it went further than I thought it would, and I thought that was a good thing. Like rather than holding back or like, cutting it down to just be like generic. Like it doesn't have to be like it can be like really over the top as much as possible. It pulled me into the scene more than anything else.
What was the old lady trying to accomplish in it, though?
That is a good question.
Was she trying to kill her? But then she ends up cursing her and then just leaving. What was the objective?
I guess cursing her didn't feel satisfying enough. She wanted to throw hands a little.
I'm not sure what the pulling the hair was, because like you said, unless she was trying to kill her, like she wasn't gonna get what she ultimately did get from her in the button. Like she wasn't gonna get that doing that the way that she did. So I really don't know. Maybe she changed her mind partway through.
Why? That was a strange gag where she just kept getting her hair ripped out by the old lady.
I had that note too.
Even
and
in
her hair
death?
never looks any different. Like it never shows. It always looks exactly
is
the
true.
same. It's so much.
That
It's
is
like
true.
I think it's at least 3 times, maybe even like 5 or 6.
One thing that I did think was interesting, now that you've brought it up, is like obviously she's cursed and like losing her shit over the course of this 3 days of the movie, but like it doesn't show physically. Like she's still very put together the entire time, which is a little weird given the nature of the movie. Like it doesn't need to be super obvious, but I think we can get a better sense of like her kind of like not being able to be as put together as she usually would.
Yeah, I think there's a few moments where that shows, but like yeah, there isn't. It's not like it's a gradual deterioration. It's scene to scene. One scene she might like be a little bit like ripped up from her like most recent encounter, and then the next one she's all done up to go meet Justin Long's parents.
Yeah. Which, by the way, this is not going to look good for me, given this is my movie. As I was writing my notes, I realized I did not remember Justin Long's name in the movie
That doesn't matter.
because he's kind of generic boyfriend. So as in my notes, I'm writing Justin Long, and I'm like,
That
I don't know why I can't remember this
I
boy's
couldn't
name.
either.
I don't.
And I only watched it 2 nights
I
ago.
do that all the time.
I think that speaks to a lot of it, like where there are points where I will admit, like I was pulled out of it enough where I'm like, a lot of the characters, like I don't necessarily remember like their names. Like I remember her boss is her boss, and I remember Stu because he's such a big part of like the bank stuff.
He was hilariously slimy. Oh, he was kind of funny.
The
Stu, yeah.
Oh,
Stu,
I got these
yeah, no,
Lakers
I
tickets.
did like, and I love Reggie Lee. I love Reggie Lee. I don't know if you guys have seen Grimm, but he's like a recurring character that becomes a main character on that, and he's just really good at it. Like, I don't think I've seen a single thing that I don't like him in
Yeah,
either.
I looked him up after because I was like, he looks familiar, and it turns out he's like a small part in a lot of things.
He's been in so many things. I think he was in The Dark Knight Rises. I think
He
that's
is.
the one
He's
that
in
he was
Dark
in.
Knight Rises. He plays two different characters in the Pirates movies. He's the guy
Yes, he
who gets
does.
his. He's the like Dutchman crew guy with the like hermit crab head who gets his head like knocked off at the one point. And then
I
he's
didn't know that was
also
him.
yeah, and then he's also one of the Singaporean sailors that they team up with at the beginning of the third movie. I think he's like the head guy of that crew, or like one of the head
Yeah,
Oh,
guys.
the early guy. He's the one that like when Elizabeth is going down the river, he's the first one that like pops up, and then he's like fairly prominent after
Yeah,
that.
he's like the one of them that gets like any kind of prominence, I think.
Yeah,
And then
he's like the central guy, which I think he works for. I think he's got like sort of like an everyman energy, but he can also go a little over the top if he needs to. Like in this, I think that he had a little bit of that like very slight over the topness that works for like his douchey kind of character in this. You
you
know?
know, now that
yeah,
I think about it, he was probably the best character.
I kind of agree, and I think we'll probably talk about this with some of the other characters. But he feels like he has a proportionate amount of like attention and depth given to him for what he is. And I don't know if you can say that for any other character. And I think that might be why he works better.
Yeah, because he doesn't, you don't need to go super deep with him, but you immediately understand the kind of person that he is just through the few actions that he does have.
They have a strong
Hmm.
intro with him, and then he has like one important action, which is just like screwing her over. He's simple, and they leave it at that. Like, that's kind of dipping into my topic, so I'll save some of those points. I have two more points real quick. The one thing about Justin Long that is not forgettable, this was such an out of pocket line. When they're at dinner, he's like, "Oh, it's not a clan rally, Mom. It's a bar." What? Why are we
What the
comparing
fuck? I know,
anything
I
to a
know.
clan rally
I'm
right
like, what are
now?
you saying?
And I think like because that's the part where she's like tripping out and like seeing stuff from the demon, so we don't hear like many parts of that conversation, and I think that's like our first line back in after one of them. Hang on, why is this being compared to anything? Like,
We need a short film where we're just seeing the dinner and we're ignoring Christine the entire time so we can know what the fuck they were talking about.
just don't write that line. Like, I'll talk about it in my topic because my topic's about genericness, and Sam Raimi like isn't specific with anything except for that line, and it's that line. Like, what the hell, man?
Yeah, where did that didn't register that weird for me when on this watch. Now that you're pointing it out. Yeah, what?
It's so out of pocket. Like, you could compare to anything. We don't even. The conversation doesn't even matter. Is the thing. Like, they could be saying anything. The whole point is that she's missing it. Like, and
You're saying he didn't
that's
have to go that extreme in comparison?
well. Just why is that your placeholder dialogue? Like, it's such a nothing line in terms of like its
Because
function.
he
You could put anything there.
I wonder if it was improvised, honestly, because like some of that stuff tends to be a little improvised too, where they're like, because it's just like you just have to have a conversation,
I don't
you
know.
know?
This is the guy who gave us "Punch Me, I Bleed," so I'm a little skeptical about that.
Listen,
So
that's a great line. I will not hear any. bashing of Punch Me, I Bleed.
It's not really the same type of weird, but they're both really weird.
He was comparing like where they met.
I think, yeah.
He was saying we didn't meet at a Klan rally, we met at a bar. Like it's still
But
Yeah,
that
something
should go
like
without
that.
saying.
Because at that was a point. I want to get into the dinner scene a lot in my topic, but that was a point where basically she was like being super judgy about like I think what is it? He's like he met her on the internet. That feels like a very normal like old style parent reaction, but also like a little overdoing it
Yeah,
for
and
me. I don't
in
know.
2009, sure, there's no natural segue from that to bring up a Klan rally. Why? There's no answer. I just wanted to shout that out because it's so out of pocket. Final note, I kind of like that the demon gets her at the end. It's more fun somehow. I don't know that it really ties a like nice thematic bow on it. I was just like, all right, yeah, I kind of like this better than a happy ending. I don't really know why. It just feels like it's what it wants to do. Like I almost feel like it's promised in.
that's it felt like it was delivering on the premise.
Like I kind of said the same
Yeah.
thing about Final Destination last year. Like you could have, and I didn't know that when I watched it, but I think you brought it up when we did it, Jelani, that like they reshot that ending where everyone dies because people didn't like that they survived, and it just something about it just kind of feels like, all right, the curse came to completion, and somehow that just at face value is kind of narratively satisfying, even if it's like a bad ending or like the negative unhappy ending, I'll say.
I definitely see what you're saying. I felt more I think sad and somber about it, especially on this watch. But I get what you're saying.
That's my note, so if you want to jump in with yours, Jelani.
So this is my first time seeing the movie. I did see the ending to it years ago when I was in like middle school, high school, one of those, 2009. This is back when my dad was still watching horror movies. He liked to show my brother and I parts of them that he thought was cool. As I've mentioned before in the Final Destination 3 episode, he showed us like a couple of deaths from like Final Destination 2. He showed us the ending to this and explained the whole thing with the button getting swapped and everything because he thought it was a cool twist, which, yeah, it is. Because they have that coin at the beginning and it's a payoff to... It's a little convenient. It's the same type of envelope and it's the same exact size. Anyway, cool twist nonetheless. Other than that, I didn't have any expectations going in. I mean, we've already been discussing our thoughts on it and whatnot. As far as anything I like enjoyed about it, I can't think of anything. Honestly, maybe Stu as a character. He was kind of funny. I did like as much as I don't think she deserved it, I liked the ending. Just the way it happened, like on the train tracks and she was getting dragged while the train was going. That was kind of cool.
That's like the best visual, which it sucks because if you see that, then obviously the ending's ruined for you.
Yeah, but never did I think I'd be watching this movie over a decade later.
Yeah, I mean this movie's like fairly old now.
15 years old.
That's it for your initials then, Jelani?
Yeah.
Evan, you already sort of touched on how your topic is about like genericness. I think that's probably a good place to start because it's very general, and I think that will probably lead really well into a couple of our things. So go right ahead.
So my topic is the curse of genericness. I felt this with the Spider-Man trilogy, and I felt it even more here. Sam Raimi, I think, writes the way you're told to write in Screenwriting 1. Our Screenwriting 1 teacher that me and Jelani had uses the 2002 Spider-Man as one of his models in Screenwriting 1 to show like what is good story structure and like doing a character arc within that. And when we talked about that, we both were like, yeah, despite everything else that you can say about that movie, it's pretty much a perfect example of the like Sid Field, Blake Snyder, Save the Cat version of a screenplay. Like if you pick up your first screenwriting book, Sam Raimi pretty much writes a movie the way that Blake Snyder tells you to in Save the Cat. But then he refuses to do any better than that.
But this movie had two climaxes.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a beat in some structure models that's like a false climax where you're like, you think it's the end, but it isn't. So he might actually be following it still there. I think it depends on which one you go off of or like what that beat is called. And also, like, this is a movie with a twist where, like, I think you could say that there's the climax when she digs up the grave, and then you could say that her getting dragged to hell is the denouement. I'm not here to split hairs about that, but if we're pointing to, yes, splitting hairs is the thing that happens.
Well, pulling
hair. I would say, despite how you might call that beat, it still fits with like a pretty basic 3-act structure thing, especially for a horror movie where you can kind of do that, like, surprise bad ending, hero dies, more than you can in other genres. So I understand the utility of having some elements or some characters in your story be simple and archetypal and easily accessible. But when everything is like that, then it stops feeling like a story and it starts feeling like a 1950s commercial or like an instructional video on, I don't know, like one of those like OSHA training videos that you're made to watch sometimes, like for work. Well, okay, it feels like that, or to be a little more generous to it, although not terribly, it feels like a fake movie. The two things it reminded me of were like the in-universe movies in The Boys and the fake horror movie that the kids watch in Diary of a Wimpy Kid. I think it's the second movie. They like have, I don't know, 2 minutes of this fake horror movie. And this felt like that, especially the ending. It felt like this was a movie where you would show maybe the person getting cursed and then cut back in at like the anvil scene and then cut back in at the end for some reason.
Yeah.
It doesn't even matter what the context would be, but like it was so basic that like it felt like it was made with the same level of intention. And I feel like that's a little too harsh against it, but a lot of it gave that vibe, and I think that's what the cost is of going super generic. You don't have to do a lot of work, and you can kind of make things very digestible and easy to understand. What you sacrifice is kind of giving the audience a reason to respect your story at all. Because it shows a real lack of care, I think. And I'm not even suggesting that Sam Raimi doesn't care. I think there is evidence to say that he does in, like, the intention he brings to his directing. From a writing perspective, you don't feel that care at all. Like, even the fact that her cat doesn't have a name. She's just like, here, kitty, kitty, like a commercial. I don't care how long she's had this cat. She would call it by name. Like,
R.I.P. the cat, bro.
That made me, I nearly cried when we got to that because I knew I knew it was coming and I was dreading it the entire time.
Cat
yeah, I mean I can't even really take it seriously because I don't know.
He took Save the Cat and flipped it on its head, killed the cat.
And he was like, haha, being subversive. Screw you, Blake Snyder. I killed the cat. How you like me now, bud? But like, it would take him no work to name this cat. You could have told her to do it on the day. You didn't even have to write the name in the script. You could have just, I don't know, called it Mittens and had her call for it in the scene on the day.
It was so little.
That's how little work it would take to just add a tiny bit of texture. Would work. Yeah, it's just the first cat name that came to my head. Like, just now. That's how little work you needed to put in to make this not feel like a commercial. For that scene specifically. And I'll throw it to you guys in a sec. Even her job feels like it's just insert job here. It's like, yeah, she's a person with a job. She goes to work to do work.
I think...
But they used it well, though.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree with that 100%. Like, if he wanted to go as generic as possible with that, he would have had her in a cubicle.
She would have been a bank teller or something like that, right? Like the fact that it was a loan officer, like I think he's the themes that he was trying to go for. I think that that particular occupation for her was a good setup to get us there. Like I think that as much as I understand what you mean about it being like a very generic way to do it, like at the same time the setup itself and the way the characters are, it is very efficient at the very least.
It's quick. I don't know if I can call it efficient because it doesn't really tell us anything. I think for it to be efficient, it would have to actually communicate something meaningful, and for my money, it does not.
As far as what, her character?
Yeah, and maybe we'll get to that more in your topic, but I think the exposition is fast, but again, it's like in a commercial. In a commercial, you have 20 seconds to, or you don't even really have that much time if you're like trying to somehow pretend that these people we're looking at are people. You have 3 seconds to set up this is a person with a job and a house. And that's all we really get from Christine, I think.
That's a really big house for a loan officer.
That's a really big house for somebody who lives by herself.
Her stairs have a landing.
And she has a whole backyard with a shed.
With a shed that has an anvil in it.
She tells us one of the few things we learned about her is that she's not really in touch with her mom. Her dad's dead. Like, who is helping her foot the bill for this house? Probably no one. I guess
It's
that
not the
bank pays
boyfriend.
really well.
It's not the boyfriend.
Apparently
But
not.
they live together, so maybe it's the boyfriend?
I don't think they do. Because he
don't
talks
live
about
together.
coming to pick her up and stuff. Like, he stays over the one time, but at the end, she's in that house by herself at night at several points. I think that's just
I don't know.
her
I
house.
thought they lived together, but I may have been mistaken. I don't know.
I thought it was implied that they didn't.
Because he was telling her, it was also like the thing about the cat. He was saying, like, you mean you have a cat? Like, normally if you're living together, you would say that it's your
Our
cat.
cat.
Like,
We
our
have
cat,
a cat.
together. Yeah. That too.
Didn't he say we have a cat? I thought he did.
Mm-mm.
I think he says you. Anyway, so to throw it to you guys, just like what do you think of the genericness? Like, is it too extreme? Am I wrong that it's generic? Are there specifics that I'm choosing to ignore here?
This is not going to sound like a point connected to anything at first. I didn't expect the psychic to be as big a player in this movie. Truth be told, I didn't expect the movie to have a psychic at all, so bonus points for taking away from genericness.
It moves
with
it
that.
slightly out of the genericness in your book, you mean?
Yeah. That being said, the entire middle part of this movie, including the climaxes, I didn't care for. The scares didn't work. They were just jump scares. I feel like they tried to build up to the jump scare. Or they did the jump scares a couple of times, but like it was just like, oh, scary image. Like there was nothing scary about the demon like torturing her for the 3 days, and that's kind of where the horror should be, you know?
Yeah, I think it's
Ah.
gross at a couple points, but it's not.
It's just nasty.
It's really just I'm
Very
here.
gross. The bile,
the
oof,
The maggots.
the nosebleed.
the
The
gross stuff
nosebleed.
that was just goofy. That was absurdly goofy. Like that felt like a parody of another movie doing something with it that's referencing a nosebleed. Like,
And the way
oh my
she
god,
held her nose, and she almost like it almost looked like she sprayed it at him, which obviously wasn't her intention. But I think that made it funnier. And I did like how he went from like concerned to that whole thing of like, did I need to get in my mouth? He was immediately freaking out of being like, well, what if I? And we'll actually touch on that in my topic too.
Yeah, so the gross stuff was gross, but I didn't understand the point. And I actually have remind me, because I didn't even make a note of it, but that reminds me of when body horror does work, and I want to bring up The Thing. But I audibly asked myself what I was watching for several scenes in this movie. Like the eye cake scene
Well, see, I think that's kind of the things like the eye scene and the gross stuff were the few times where I'm not going to say I was enjoying myself more, but I was like, okay, at least this is like something that Sam Raimi is bringing to it. He's kind of good at this because he gave us the most nothing story ever.
I also expected to have like trouble sleeping after this because I'm not good with horror movies in general. I already said before, I think a couple of times on these horror movie episodes, that my brain becomes irrational once I see a horror movie like, oh, well, that thing is after me now because I know it exists. I slept like a baby after this. Like, I expected to, like, keep one eye open throughout the night because I'm already bad with horror movies, but, like, my kryptonite with horror movies are usually ghost/demon horror movies, like, because those can just
Creepy entities like shadow things too,
they
which
do
there's a
they
lot
do
of
what
in
they
this.
want. They do what they want. The other one is Final Destination, but that's a whole other thing. Yeah, and I thought the in between of this movie, between the beginning and the end, because I already knew the ending, I thought that would be like, all right, I gotta prep myself for the horror that is coming. I'm gonna be scared. I wasn't.
But you weren't. Yeah, it's not a scary movie is the thing too, and I feel like I probably should have told you guys that before going into. Oh, I guess the images themselves aren't so much scary as they are like what I would usually refer to as like provocative imagery. Like they're meant to get you to respond just in general, whether that's you're being scared. It's almost like it's gonna pop out at you, as opposed to it needing to be something scary or something that's gonna make it hard for you to sleep. Like I think they lean into the horror comedy here like Evil Dead does, and they're not really trying to scare you, if that makes sense.
So you've seen Evil Dead, I take it then.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen Evil Dead's 1 and 2.
Okay, so this like matches with like
Well, I
that
found this out
tone.
today actually. So this harkens a lot back to Evil Dead in like certain scenes, but it also I found out I think according to Sam Raimi they're in the same universe, which given this feels like it kind of makes sense, and that's kind of cool too. Like if you'd seen it, it kind of adds to it because Evil Dead focuses on something very specific also, but it kind of knowing that makes the world building feel a little more wide, right? Because it's like there's different creepy like magical monster things in this world, and you're not gonna encounter everyone every time something like this happens. Like there's little things that are gonna and this makes it feel like this is like, okay, this is a very particular experience is happening. They're going after a particular monster. So it harkens a lot back to that, but it's not meant to be like neither one is really meant to be scary. I think it's just like the stuff in Evil Dead is a lot more like nightmare fuel. I guess it gets visceral in a different way. Like the
Gory.
body horror in this feels like it's leaning a lot more into like the silliness and like how gross it is.
So what I'm hearing is that what Sam Raimi really needed to do was have Bruce Campbell show up at the end and say, "I'm here to talk to you about the Evil Dead initiative," and this is
I am
split
I
to Evil Dead.
I shit you not. I actually heard also that Bruce Campbell, I don't know if he actually shot it, but he was supposed to have a cameo at the end that I think never got
I was
done.
waiting for
And
him
there's
to show up. I was like, he's
speculation.
got to be here, right?
He should have been. He should have been, honestly. Even if it was as a different character, because we know from Spider-Man he can be a different character in the same
In
universe,
all
and
three
it doesn't matter.
movies.
Well,
And
he's
it
supposed to be
doesn't
Mysterio,
matter.
wasn't he?
Or he just gets progressively worse jobs over those three
What
movies.
wasn't he supposed to be Mysterio?
Yeah, well,
Apparently.
they were going to capitalize on him being different characters in each of these movies, but I think the initial idea was probably just for him to cameo because it's Bruce Campbell and it's a Sam Raimi movie. Kind of like how he does in Multiverse of Madness, where he's like the whatever it is.
Pizza ball guy.
That's a pretty good scene. Yeah,
It's
that's
the
pretty
only
great. He's
good
like the
scene in the
pizza guy.
movie.
You said that's the only good scene
But
in that movie, Evan.
Yeah, I know you disagree, but
I raised you an Illuminati massacre.
I know
Alright.
that didn't do
that's
anything
pretty.
for me.
Yeah,
I know you loved it, but
It was cool.
that was a good scene. Anyway, yeah, I agree that if Bruce Campbell had been in this movie it would have been so much better. I don't know that given the way the movie was executed, it necessarily would have fit, but I wouldn't have cared because it would have tied into Evil Dead.
I don't think it really would have mattered. It makes sense what you're saying, though. Like, especially just like for expectations from a director, even without having seen Evil Dead, I could kind of feel that, like, when he's doing more gory things and doing more, like, horror themed shots, he seems more comfortable and much more sure of himself in those scenes and is, like, bringing some kind of voice and, like, sauce to it.
I've seen kill counts on the newer Evil Dead stuff. Those look decent as far as horror goes, but I don't know if that's Raimi behind them.
I don't think that it is. I think there's at the very least he's not directing them,
He
right?
might
So
be
I think it's
like a producer.
yeah,
I'll
he's
look it up.
producing, but he's definitely not directing them. So it's the Evil Dead, which was the one with Jane Levy that came out in like 2013, and then Evil Dead Rise, which came out last year. But those are like different directors. I think they're closer to like being like actual, I don't want to say actual horror, but more like scary horror and meant to be more frightening, whereas the old ones were strictly like horror comedies.
Yeah, so the remake from 2013 was directed by Fede Alvarez, who just did the Alien reboot, Alien
Oh.
Romulus.
Right, with Alien Romulus, okay.
And then it's Lee Cronin for the one from last year, Evil Dead Rise. I don't know that name. And it looks like he's done a few small horror movies, but long and short of it, Sam Raimi is not in the director's chair for those. To try to finish us out with this topic, Angel, do you have any pushback for me? Am I wrong that this is really generic? Or, like, is that more okay for you that it's generic?
I think it is, and I actually I want to start with a couple points you made. As far as like what you were saying about this feeling like a fake movie within movies, that didn't click for me until you said something, but I realized like I kind of agree. And it makes me think about this isn't exactly the same thing, but Thanksgiving, which came out I think last year,
Yeah.
which was based on like a fake trailer that Eli Roth made, I think for Grindhouse, if I'm remembering correctly. For me, weirdly, that elevates it a little more because I always thought that the fake movies within movies always looked fun, and it would be cool to see them actually happen. This is seeing that from the other end, where it's like this is a movie that exists in real life that feels that way. So I can see why that would like kind of push back against it. And there's elements where I agree a little bit with some of the genericness. So one point that I noticed a lot this time was the way that they execute the torturing over the course of the 3 days, like by the demon. It's one of the things that stood out to me because it's a problem I tend to run into in my own writing, where it's kind of like the events themselves kind of become generic as placeholders, where it'll be like you want there to be like a meaningful reason why each specific part of like a curse or like a haunting or something is happening, and whatever it's leading up to. And you kind of put in like little things where it's like, okay, this sequence seems cool, or like this seems like an idea that just kind of makes sense, right? But then the whole thing is like during rewrites, you kind of change those to make them fit more organically, to add to things a little bit, to focus a lot on like the themes and the characters and really like highlight them and bring them out. I will say this time I couldn't quite put my finger on like why it wasn't working for me while I was watching it, but now I realize like it's because they feel a little generic. Like the demon isn't doing anything specifically to make Christine think about herself or her own actions, which I think does speak to the whole. And then we'll get into this a little bit in Jelani's topic, but it'll be like, does the character really deserve this? Like, this is not a horror movie where Christine is supposed to like really learn some kind of lesson, because I think ultimately this feels more like a bad day situation where this one mistake happens to be a really bad thing and there's going to be ridiculously dire consequences. This could have equally been like a perfectly normal person that she did this to, and then nothing would have happened. It's not proportional.
What you're making me think of in saying that is, I hadn't picked up on this, but I think there's no why to a lot of like the demon's actions throughout it. Like, we
Exactly.
understand the motivation of I'm going to curse you because you screwed me over, but like the times that it shows up after that, it's just like, I'm here, we're gonna do a little horror set piece, but there's not really like a purpose to it. It's just kind of like it again kind of feels like what happens when you rely too heavily on the first screenwriting book you pick up. You're like, well, okay, it says that on page 60 there has to be a midpoint, and on page 75, bad guys have to close in. So I got to write that scene now, but then you don't connect it. That's always the trap that I hear people warn against, and what I also warn people against who are like,
Hmm.
when I've talked to people who are like just getting into screenwriting, I'm like, here's a book to start out. Read it and then don't take it as gospel, because if you try to write your movie deliberately to this, it's going to be bad.
This is not your finished product. This is to get you started.
And I think nobody has told Sam Raimi that, because I think that's kind of why these set pieces are happening where they are. Partly because I think he just wants to make cool horror set pieces, which is fine. But there's no real narrative purpose to it. And again, like you were kind of saying, like, okay, maybe I figured this out on rewrites. I think that's a very normal part of the writing process to like when
Yeah.
you're outlining or even in a first draft, you might be like, yeah, this part doesn't really fit, but I want to like get the shape of this thing together. So I'll just kind of set that aside and then go back to it later. That's fine. I think that is just natural. A lot of times you don't have it all together before you set out to like write your first couple of drafts. It is kind of your responsibility as the writer to go back and fill those in though. Especially if you don't have like a deadline to meet. Sometimes you just got to get the thing done, and that can show sometimes when that's the case. But I don't think it would have taken a lot of work for him to fill in some of those things. It's also just, I get the sense, and again, not to like trash on his Spider-Man trilogy more than we already have, but across those three movies and this, I think it's just never something that he cares to do. I think he legitimately thinks that, okay, I did the thing that the screenwriting book told me to. Maybe he's not thinking about it in exactly those terms, but he's like, all right, I got a motivation for them. Cool. I'm gonna leave it at that and just never justify it more. He does like very, very functional screenwriting one A plus work, but you got to take screenwriting too, bud. Come on, like please, just do a little more than this.
I think you might be being a little harsh, but I
I
definitely
might be.
understand with I understand what you're saying, and I agree with parts of it. I think to a degree there was a level of that where there was a lot of studio interference, especially on the last one. Like it's famous for studio interference. Like there was stuff that he just did not want to do. As far as the stuff where it's like, well, you have the basics down, you got to build on that from there. And that's something that I just said is very prominent in Drag Me to Hell specifically, where it feels like they don't necessarily feel like problems of like not caring to do the thing, but they feel like first draft problems that just never got fixed. Like he fixed parts of
Yes.
the script and like and I don't even want to say fixed. I would say like focused on reshaping them to fit better with things, but he didn't necessarily do that with all of this. So like you needed a little more to elevate certain scenes.
One thing I'll give him is the twist at the end. He sets that up decently. I did not guess that. And, it's not a like S tier twist, but it's
But
it's
it's
fine. It's
effective.
pretty decent. Yeah, it's a good little oh no psych at the end. He does plant the seeds of it and gets that done. So that was something that I can at least say like, yeah, there's some intention there. I think it's very clear that he does not care about his characters or telling a character story with a good arc here. That is very clearly not his intention.
Oh yeah, no. And I also think that in certain cases, like, that's fine. So I do think also that there is a certain degree to which it could be the longevity of this. So I also found out today that I'm pretty sure he wrote this 10 years prior to when it came out with his brother. And so they were working on it together. So that would have been around, 1999, 2000, something like that. But then he got caught up working on the Spider-Man movies, and so he wasn't able to make this. And I think that that kind of thing can have a very detrimental effect when you're not willing to like change from a lot of these initial ideas. Now, there's some cases where that can work. So, like, one example that I love is Superbad. Like, the writers of that started writing that in high school, which is why it feels very authentic. But they also had learned a lot by the time they made the movie, so they were able to like
Yeah, I'm
update
sure they
things
didn't
and
take the
change it
draft
from a
they
story
wrote when they were
perspective. No,
13.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think that to an extent, like, and you got to remember too, like Sam Raimi had been making movies well before that. Like we just talked about, it was his birthday the other day. Like he's in his 60s now.
Yeah, and
Um,
Evil Dead was from
so
like the 80s,
and
right?
Evil Dead
Like
was
he's been
from
at
the
it for a
80s.
minute.
Yeah, Evil Dead exactly. So he'd been making movies for a while, but there's also like you learn, especially like when you go and you do other movies for a while, and you're kind of going back to like what your roots are. Especially like he had also spent years making the big studio movies that were the Spider-Man movies. Like he spent years doing that, so he kind of like had to go back to this something that was kind of already done and get into his groove again. I think this was kind of his go back to his old roots thing. So it makes sense there's a couple like growing pains in the sense of like almost regrowing pains going back into the genre he was familiar with when he had been doing superhero movies that honestly to me felt elevated because he brought his own uniqueness to them, especially the Doc Ock scene in Spider-Man 2 highlights a lot of his strengths, which I think is why those scenes feel unique is because, it's not a whole movie of them. They're adding a little bit of an extra twist to a completely different genre, right? Which is why getting very specific directors like this to do things like superhero movies or like action thrillers, stuff like that can be really cool because you're getting a version of it that feels like it's got a little flavor to it because it's doing something that the director themselves are familiar with. But when you have a whole movie like this, it's almost the thing of like too much of the one thing that is adding flavor to other movies can feel like it's kind of like missing some of what should be the basics of like a big movie like this, especially with like a big director in this style. The Demon's a big example of where it comes in like, okay, you definitely needed to make that a little more at least related to what Christine is going through specifically. Like
Yeah,
there's a
there's
lot
not a
of
lot of
background
connective
stuff that we talked
tissue
about.
there.
Exactly. Like it's just kind of torturing her for a few days and a lot of the stuff outside of that they're discussing of like the why this happened. There's a little bit about her family background, but like you could have inserted some of the stuff with her mom into the way the demon is torturing her. Like it's an ethereal demon from hell, like it can make her see whatever it wants. It could have added to some of that and kind
I
of
think
made
that
that like a highlight of it, but it just kind of didn't do that. It's hard to say like if there's a right or wrong way to have done it, but I think that it needed a little more connection to what was going on with Christine personally. And that's where I agree where it got a little bit generic and it didn't necessarily hit for me in that sense.
Yeah, I think that ties into Jelani's topic. So if we want to transition into that, I did have one final note on the genericness to close us out, but I think it transitions as well. Just like at best, I think doing something in a super generic way like this, at best that can be funny. It can also get to be annoying and distancing, and at worst, I think it becomes disrespectful. And this is where I think it'll tie into Jelani's topic about the protagonist. Like, when you write characters in such a cookie cutter way where you give them no specifics and don't give them motivations, like, there's a clear lack of respect there. It makes you not care for them, which is not good in any case. I think at worst it ends up playing into stereotypes. Like, I'm not calling out Sam Raimi to, like, cancel him or say that he's doing this from a really bad place. He does kind of lean
Hmm.
into the, like, brown people are very into mysticism trope in this movie pretty hard. And I think,
Yeah.
I'm not saying that comes from, like, a racist place or anything. I think it is a really negative side effect that can happen when your default is to go super generic like this, is that you are doing just that stereotype and adding zero nuance or care beyond it.
You think it should have been a white woman?
You
think the psychic should have been a white lady?
I'm not necessarily saying that. I just think that that's sort of a byproduct that can happen when you approach character like this. Like, that's sort of the worst outcome you can get, is like, if your characters are bland, okay, we're just not going to care. At worst, it just kind of turns everyone into a stereotype. And when you're dealing with something that has a bit of a history, like the brown people doing voodoo type thing, it can just kind of contribute to that more than if you give them some kind of care and nuance, and maybe you'll think to not do that if you're like approaching character with more intention.
You might want to cut this out because I'm just misinformed. Are gypsies usually Russian?
I think sometimes.
Well,
yeah.
she's Hungarian. The character, I think, is Hungarian.
She's Hungarian, but they were speaking Russian at her funeral. Do Hungarians speak Russian?
Hungarian. I don't think they were speaking Russian. I don't think they were speaking Russian.
I think the subtitles said Russian at some points. But I don't think it's a stretch to say. I don't know a ton about that area, but I think they're pretty close geographically. And I know Russian tends to be spoken in a lot of countries like surrounding it, so it might make sense.
Okay, so my topic is crafting an unlikable protagonist for a horror movie. Christine didn't deserve it, like, at all. For this movie, I feel like her character was in the middle of the road. She was lying about the decision. She could have extended Miss Ganush's payment period, but at the same time, she said something about volunteering to save cats or something at one point. Like, she has rescued or saved cats or something.
Dogs. She said she volunteers at a puppy shelter.
Okay, yeah. And I feel as if the movie was trying to have it both ways. Like, she's not a good person, but you should feel bad for her. And this being in the middle of the road didn't work for me, personally. At the end, we had her admitting to being the one behind the decision to take the house away. But then the ending felt as if, like, yeah, it was a payoff, but with her admitting that last second, it felt as if the movie was saying, too late to apologize for that. You should have apologized earlier. And then it dragged her to hell. Again, in reality, she did nothing wrong. What she did, that's life, dude. Like, Mrs. Ganush was lucky to receive those 2 extensions. I'm sure there are banks that would have taken the house the second she was late on the payment. So, Christine making the decision to not extend the payment, is that worth cursing somebody? Well, first scrapping with them for 5 minutes, and then cursing them? Like, to eternal damnation? Nah. No. Because you lost the house you've been in for 30 years. Like, alright, dude. You could have blamed the boss, but it's not really his fault either. Like, he claimed to have higher-ups hanging over his head, and I wouldn't even blame those higher-ups. Like, it sounds like I'm being a corporal simp right now. That's not what I'm getting at.
I kind of get what?
Wait, a what?
A corporal simp. Even if he didn't have those bosses hanging over his head, I don't think anyone in... Like, they didn't have any evil people in this movie. I don't think anybody deserved to burn in hell for all of eternity, except for the one willing to curse somebody to hell for all of eternity. Which is what she tried to do at the end, but, you know, movie's got a movie. So, I have a question. What is the right choice? Do you make the protagonist wholly unlikable or completely likable? The latter is a tragedy, which kind of coincides with horror, but the former may make it unwatchable unless the person playing the protagonist is charismatic. Like, you have to cast right for that. We've seen villains and protagonists that were supposed to be unlikable on paper, but likable in the performance, allowing the audience to stomach following them, or even want to follow them.
Yeah, I think making her innocent is definitely the easier choice to make this work.
Yeah. I'm kind of glad they didn't go that route where it's like they made her a little bit doe-eyed at the beginning maybe, but then like, we see in the car scene that like, she can get scrappy if she needs to. She called the old woman a bitch and things like that. Like they definitely make it clear that like when it comes down to it, she's capable of taking care of herself, which does lead well into like the way that they execute the rest of the movie, where it's like she does some fucked up things to survive, or to hopefully survive, and things like that, kind of showing that desperation as time goes on. And I don't even think it makes her unlikable. I think that for the most part, she is pretty likable. I wouldn't even say likable either. Like, likable on paper, in that, yeah, they bring in, like, she volunteers at the puppy shelter. She does try to come up with a couple solutions when she has to say no to the woman. But there's a lot of, like, and we'll get into this more of my topic, but there's a lot of pressure on her to sort of give in to these, like, corporate demands to kind of get herself ahead, which I think is a big part of this too. It's very clear that like, doing what you are told you like quote unquote have to do is the path to success. And it's sort of like the mistake here was less that she took away this old woman's house, instead that it's like she gave into that pressure and made one bad decision and is now paying for it disproportionately.
Right.
Because I would agree with you, Jelani, like that she didn't deserve it. I also don't think that as bad as I feel for the old woman at the beginning, and I continue to feel bad for her, like her situation was also bad. Like banks are parasitic in that sense, like, and they don't care. Like, and in a way, you're right. She was lucky to get 2 extensions, but that doesn't mean that I don't feel bad for her too. Like, what the hell else was she supposed to do? She's on a fixed income. They said she's sick. Like, there's really not a lot that she could do to, like, change her situation. But at the same time, that doesn't mean cursing the woman
Right.
who is sort of the cog in the machine in this situation is the correct move. That, to
Right.
me, was a horrible decision, where it kind of, when we get to the end and she's like, I'm gonna shove the button down her throat, I was kind of on her side with that, because, like, yeah, I think the only one so far that has deserved it, besides Stu, is this woman.
I don't even think
You
Stu
know?
deserved it. He was
No, no,
slimy,
no, no,
but
no.
to burn
Stu
in
is the
hell?
closest, though. Out of the living characters, Stu is probably the closest, because he's a spineless little rat boy, I
Well,
think.
I think we
To
also
me.
just get it's communicated that he is a slimy guy who will go and do underhanded things. Like, I think the death zone that this is getting into is what you said at the beginning, Jelani. Like, they got her so middle of the road that it can just kind of flip flop the whole time between, like, is she a jerk or is she a nice person? It kind of just leans on both when it needs to, because like I was saying with everything in this, we learn so little about her that we don't get anything to empathize with. Like, I think there's a way to do this where if she is going to be unlikable, let's say, or like if the movie is going to definitively paint the inciting incident decision that she makes as wrong, then you can still, I think my solution, if you're going to pick like the unlikable route, is make us sympathize with her in some way. And I think it does a little bit of that work with, like, we've all been in a situation where like our boss is telling us to do something that maybe feels unethical, but it's our job. So we're supposed to do our job. Like, I think that's a very relatable decision. The problem in this movie is that it ends up muddying the waters of, is that even her decision? And like you were saying, Jelani, like, is she really the person who should be punished for this? The area is pretty gray on that. Like, she's basically the messenger in that situation. And that's not really a good, like, if you're going to base your whole movie around that, pick a different situation, because this is just too, like, commit one way or the other. I don't think it's a make or break whether you decide to make her likable and like say that she's innocent and is being unfairly punished, or if you end up saying, yeah, okay, you made your choice, that's it. There is a movie that I don't want to name for spoilers, but it does that, and I think it's very effective.
Is it Tenet?
It is not Tenet.
It's always Tenet with him, though.
No, it's not Tenet. Unless I really, I don't know. There's a lot of decisions in that movie that I don't understand. So maybe if I think about it more, but no, it's a much simpler movie that I do want to do on the show someday. Pick one way or the other and make it clear. Like if you're going to make her more human with flaws, then you got to build out more to empathize with, which it doesn't do.
That's what I was gonna say. Like there is, you really don't have to choose between the two if you can make her a fully fledged 3-dimensional character. As far as, oh, she does some things that are kind of, that's being human, kind of shady sometimes, doing things, okay, she's mainly a good person, but she has this side to her, maybe she's a little whatever, this negative trait. So there is a way to have both. You could have played it middle of the road, but like you said, I don't think we know enough about her to where we could fully believe in the flip-flop.
Yeah, and what we
like
do
the
learn
plot,
doesn't
We don't know where the middle of the road
Right.
is, kind of.
It felt like the plot was just telling her, okay, now we need you to be a jerk in this scene.
The scene that I felt at the worst was when she's drinking coffee at the diner and the waitress comes over and she's like, keep bringing me coffee, or whatever she says. She goes full Bully Maguire on the waitress.
Oh my god, she did.
And then
You'll get your coffee when you fix this
damn
door.
yes. But then, not 30 seconds after that, Stu comes in and she's like all set to curse him, and then is like, no, I think I'm gonna end. You could play that like across the whole movie. I think if she is sometimes being a jerk to people in some scenes and then finds it in her to be empathetic and it's like, I've been through this. Even this guy who kind of screwed me over and is maybe kind of a bad dude, I don't wish that upon him either. That can work, but not when she's being a Karen at this service worker 30 seconds before. And I think that whiplash comes from just, like, it's the most telling moment to me of the lack of care that is put into this and all the other characters. We want her to be unlikable here, so we're going to make her do something unlikable. But you need to root for her, so now we're going to throw in this thing.
She saved dogs. Now she saved dogs after she
But
killed
not
her
cats,
cat.
though.
It's like line to line and scene to scene. I can't tell if they want us to root for her or not because they're flip-flopping so much. Like, even the little bits of backstory, it's like, okay, apparently we get a little bit about, like, her mom is alcoholic and her dad died and she was, like, fat-shamed as a kid and still people are calling her out for it now. Okay, that's something. It never matters. Like, the only way it matters at all is that all of a sudden Justin Long's mom likes her now in this dinner scene, and that has zero impact beyond that scene.
Because she ends up not liking her by the end anyway because she freaks out.
Yeah.
So,
Mm-hmm.
okay.
I do want to talk about that later because there are some inconsistencies that kind of tie into my topic that are a little back and forth. It's a little weird.
What are some good examples? I'm sure there's plenty. What are some good examples of a wholly unlikable protagonist or a likable protagonist with a tragic ending, perhaps? I wrote plenty of examples. Help me name them, and I didn't come up with any examples myself. I assumed you guys would have some.
I could probably come up with. I don't have one ready to go right now.
Yeah, me neither. I don't have one off the top of my head.
If I look up
Unlikable.
a list, maybe.
Homelander, but he's not a protagonist. Well, technically.
Well, in a way, he is. I think. I
He's
think
more
in
of a
some way, like there are
POV
points where we
character, at
follow him
least.
enough where we're meant to understand we're meant to try to understand what's going on with him. Like he's not a villain where we're fully detached from him. Like we're meant to have a little bit of sympathy in particular areas. I think.
Soldier Boy, also in the same vein.
Soldier Boy 2.
Okay, here I'll give you an answer. Everyone on Game of Thrones, I think, is an answer for that. I've been rereading the first book, and there's some stuff in the books that don't quite make it into the show, and I think it's a fantastic example of like showing characters in shades of gray, especially the Starks in that first book are like kind of they're like more upstanding and like better people than the Lannisters, who are kind of the only other major players in that part of the story. But there's even stuff like this doesn't really make it into the show, but like Catelyn is like awful to Jon in like their two or three interactions. Maybe it does make it, and I don't remember. But she
That's actually
literally
why she was
says,
like my least favorite character. Like upon rewatches, I'm like, she is awful. And there was no redeeming
Seriously.
qualities about her for me after
I
that
think
either.
there's redeeming qualities. I
Sure.
typically am rooting. I tend to be Team Stark, but like even
Hmm.
Ned is like he's probably the most like traditionally noble character in
Which is
that
why,
universe.
spoilers, he gets clapped.
Yeah, but even before that, there's some like, and that's a flaw for him because in order to actually do like a greater good that he's trying to accomplish, you can make a very good argument that he should just play dirtier and like
Yeah.
be willing to be a little more underhanded so that he can't get played by Littlefinger and stuff. So even then it's like with a character that I'd say out of anybody in that show, Ned Stark is the most like specifically portrayed as good. There
On
is
paper, likable.
yeah, there's
Yeah.
nuance within that
Likable
still.
to tragic end. They highlight his self-righteousness too, and why that's also a negative. Like, and they portray it as a negative trait too, especially like when we get more context for like Jamie specifically. Like he's one of those characters. He's very quick to judge Jamie for what he did like before the show happened with the Mad King, and he never got to a point like we did where we kind of understand where that decision came from, but he also never tried. And so they make clear that like he's likable and he's a good guy, but that is something that's where his flaw is he's unable to look past that very specific set of morals, which is ultimately what led to him. So I agree, that's a good example.
Yeah, like every character in that show, even the good characters have flaws, and even the worst characters are like I'd say for most of the run of that show, Melisandre was my least favorite character, and by the end I was like, man, I kind of feel a little bad for her, even despite everything
Yeah.
that she's done.
Me
And
with
that's like,
Cersei.
granted,
Easily
you have a
Cersei.
lot of time in that show and a lot of characters and a lot of like, that's a very extreme example. But I think that show is still very conscious. Like, George R. R. Martin does a fantastic job of building out very complex characters. And that takes work. I get why Sam Raimi is leaning on this stuff because it's easy. And I think it's not what he's interested in. I do blame him. I'm not letting him get off scot free for this because it does make it significantly worse. Like, I think it is a bad decision. He could still be going about it a better way.
You know what's also what also sucks about this is it's not like a slasher horror movie where we don't have enough time. It's an ensemble class, and we don't have enough time to learn about these characters before they're killed off. We just have her because she's the one that's in immediate danger, and it just it sucks because we spend the whole movie with her, but there's no time given as to who she is.
And to compare to something like Final Destination or like a slasher, is that Final Destination has more of a hook. There's like a mystery of how are these kills going to come about? How are we going to stop them? This has kind of that with the demon, but we're all following one character the whole time, and it is about a decision she makes. Like the inciting incident of the movie and the entire central conflict is rooted in a character choice. So if that's going to be the case, it's a problem when you don't really tell us who your character is.
I do still think we get enough of a sense of her. At least, like, yeah, there's some stereotype stuff there. There's some, like, not archetype stuff, too. Like, the kind of protagonist she is a very common one, I think. And so we do get
Blank
a
slate.
little bit of a sense of that, but you're right. I don't think it's necessarily enough the entire time. Because, again, like, the way that the horror is executed, it doesn't tie into that character decision. that we're talking about. And I think that's the main problem with it, is like the actual horror of it didn't need to matter, or it didn't matter in relation to that characterization, but it should have. I think it would have elevated like those set pieces and made them feel like they mattered in a way that this just doesn't do. And I don't know that it's what you're saying, where it's necessarily like that he doesn't care to do it, but I will admit it does seem like it's something like he's more interested in like the quote unquote fun aspects of it, with, the body horror and
Anvil.
the crazy over the topness of it. And like in some places it works. Like for example, I really liked the Lee Prowse character. I think we all did.
I think it's more that I like him than I like his character. I think
Sure,
he's
sure. But
elevating that
I think he
role.
brings a lot. I think he brings a lot, and I don't think his character necessarily feels typical. Like I feel like in a lot of cases he would have either disappeared really early on and just kind of been in that one scene at the beginning that he's in, or he would have said a lot more of like the
Ominous
very
stuff, kind of.
ominous sort of like what would be the word for like wibbly wobbly timey wimey stuff, but with like magic, like arcane gobbledygook stuff almost, that like Sam Raimi's
What?
writing it like generic like mysterious magic language.
Yeah, you're saying like the equivalent of when like the action hero goes to the computer nerd to have them explain the MacGuffin. He would have been
Yeah,
that
kinda.
equivalent for the horror movie.
Adding
Kinda,
quantum
yeah,
to
yeah,
everything.
like
Yeah.
so,
In English,
something
damn
like
it!
that. Exactly, yeah, and I think that they don't necessarily do that with him. Like he like, and it's with little nuances where it's like, like Justin Long has a quote from something about like like science over superstition or something like that, and then he kind of builds on it where he's like, well, you're right, but you can't explain everything away with logic type thing. And I think that I thought that like little bits like that where it's like it's very clear that he understands what people think of his profession, but to him he knows that there's authenticity to it, and that's enough, and like he's comfortable in that. And then like we actually see him like trying to help, but also like being, it's clear that like he understands like you're asking me to apply like very specific science to this thing that doesn't necessarily have logic. It's just whatever the hell this demon wants to do. Like we can try, but we're not necessarily gonna like get there. Oh, and I guess we get into my topic then. So it does kind of tie into a lot of things, and like part of the reason that I think this worked for me, and mine's kind of like the way that this movie uses body horror to highlight themes about apathy. A lot of the body horror here is a lot grosser than I remember. There's a lot of bile. There's the nosebleed thing.
When she falls from the casket and it's like vomiting in her mouth.
That was like a little much, but I think that all of it, I realized it more this time than I did the first time I watched it. Like, I think there's a reason that all of that is there, and I think to me that, like, it doesn't quite highlight it enough because the generic stuff is all still there, and there's still a little bit of a distance from it, but I kind of get what he was going for. What I noticed was, like, kind of how people reacted to a lot of these moments. It really starts when the old woman shows up. She kind of appears out of nowhere, and then kind of one of the first things you notice about her is that she is coughing, she's spitting up like nasty liquid and things like that. It's very clear that she's very sick. You feel bad, but at the same time, it feels like it's designed to elicit a response of like disgust from the other characters, and at the very least like a sort of like that's pretty gross from the audience, right? And I think that because people are reacting with that level of like apathy rather than sympathy, it kind of highlighted that part of what Christine is struggling with, and it definitely could have been explained a little better, but part of what she's struggling with is the world that she's found herself in. Apathy is kind of what seems to be the path to success. So she's in this sort of like cutthroat banking industry in a way where it's like she's a loan officer. She's trying her best to help out, but she's basically given like a door A, door B situation at the beginning, where her boss is basically like, "You need to show me that you can be ruthless, or this guy who is kind of an asshole but gives me like basketball tickets is gonna just get your job because he spends all this time like cutting you down and kissing up to the main boss, right? And you're not doing this. You at least need to show that you can be ruthless if you need to. So that's kind of the situation she finds herself in, and she makes one decision that ultimately has really, really dire consequences that, like we were saying before, aren't necessarily justified.
So do you think the body horror is like meant to shake her out of apathy, or
No,
it,
no.
okay,
I think it's meant to highlight the apathy of a lot of these characters, and I'll get into it a little bit
in
now.
their reaction
Um,
to it?
yeah. The fact that everybody is kind of reacting to these terrible situations these people are in. Like, this is a sick old woman. She's on a fixed income, and, she doesn't really have a lot of other people around her. But everyone's first reaction is, and Justin Long highlights this really well in like one of his early lines, basically like, like what did this woman expect? You don't pay your bills, your house gets taken away. He's upset that this woman attacked his girlfriend, but at the same time, it also shows he's in a position of privilege that a lot of other people aren't, and it's very easy for him and her boss and Stu to look at it from that perspective of like, well, it's as simple as you didn't do this thing. It's not right of you to take it out on other people. But the fact is, like, they're only seeing it from the perspective of like how it's affecting them and the people close to them, right? And you kind of see it too in like how people are reacting, or Christine specifically is reacting to how sick this woman is. Like, yeah, it's a little gross that she's coughing up stuff, into a napkin and then putting her hands all over her desk, sure. But you also got to understand too, like, that is something that, she's clearly very sick. It's not the most morally right reaction to look at it that way, is like, oh, this old woman is just like really gross and nasty.
So you're saying there's not a whole lot of walking in each other's shoes, like putting yourself in each other's shoes. So
Yeah, sort of. And honestly, a better example of it is probably the way that Justin Long's mother is in this. Like, she's very open in almost a cartoonish way about how it's like, well, you can't, like, we need you to be with somebody that we approve of, who's from like, to us, like a better family, and sort of like has money, like somebody who's more like us than somebody like this other woman. Like, again, she blatantly like distances herself from people that she considers beneath her, and in a way that honestly to me makes her feel like one of the more evil characters in the movie. Even when Christine is clearly having like some kind of mental breakdown, she started to like her, but then this one thing happens, and she's like, she tells Justin Long like, Don't go after her. She's a sick girl."
I will give you that. I think there is a consistency of characters like not looking out for each other and being very unsympathetic towards each other and selfish. I hesitate to say that it is an intentional theme. I think it feels a little more accidental, or at least not done with full intention.
I don't get how it connects to the body horror still though.
I'm a little bit missing that too.
I kind of tied this into it a little last minute, but I definitely think that there's stuff here. So those are like the physical manifestations of a lot of stuff, especially with the old woman. The bile stuff, when she goes into the funeral and the old woman lands on her, and in a lot of her visions, for whatever reason, the old woman is like spitting bugs into her mouth or something like that, which is a little much. It was pretty nasty. This is also still, if you think about her situation outside of the things that are happening to the protagonist, she was a sick woman who didn't like deserve to have her house taken away,
Oh, I
and
think I'm starting to see it. I'm sorry. The feeling of apathy, it happens with Christine and between Christine and the old lady. And then the stuff starts happening to her, but there's not a whole lot of empathy being given to Christine when all of the body horror and stuff is happening. Well, at least in public. Like the nosebleed, like you were saying earlier, the boss goes from being concerned to concerned about himself, and worried if the blood got in his
Exactly.
mouth.
Like when he's like the blood sprays on him and stuff like that. Yeah, exactly.
There's the scene with the fly at the dinner table where the fly comes out. Gross, but
But their immediate reaction
yeah, the
is
mom
like, is there any in the cake? Did she make a bad cake with flies
It's
in it?
not like, are you okay?
Instead of like, are you okay?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Like, no.
Oh, okay. And then at the, I guess it was a wake where the body falls on her. That scene, I don't know if like the bile coming out was real or not. I don't know if they filled dead bodies.
I feel like that was a hallucination of hers.
Yeah, okay. I think there's I feel like I hear that's a sort of a thing they do to like preserve bodies for funerals. They like, I don't know the process, but there's like embalming liquid or whatever.
Yeah, but that didn't look like embalming fluid.
It looked like
embalming fluid looks a little different.
And then really the only sense of empathy we get at the end is, and even then you could spin it and say it's about, him trying to save his image if you wanted to go that deep. But the only sense of empathy we get for at the end is, aside from dude actually giving her $10,000, like it's nothing, to her actually being dragged to hell, like, oh no, I gotta save my girlfriend. And by then it's too late. So I kind of get it.
I see you want it. It did take a minute, but I think I do see what you're saying, like, in tying these two together. I am not sold that Sam Raimi, like, is fully fleshing out a theme here. I don't want to deny that he might have had some intention there in, like, using the body horror to thematic effect. I do get a sense that he just kind of likes using gross imagery at face value to the point that, like, I don't think it's intentional every time. I do think the examples you've pointed to, like the dinner scene and the wake and the nosebleed, those scenarios I think are a place where they are connected in that kind of thematic way, though. I don't think it's true of everything. Some of it, I think it's just he's doing gross stuff
for the
anvil
for sure.
Stuff. The anvil, there's nothing thematic in that anvil scene.
He just wanted to use an anvil.
But I don't want to say that to cheapen your point, though.
He put that stuff in there on purpose. Like, to an extent, it was intentional. I think maybe what you're saying is it's not executed perfectly, and it's definitely not. It's definitely not like there's definitely points where
confused.
There's definitely points where it's definitely over the top for the sake of being over the top, because that's kind of Sam Raimi's style. Like, you haven't seen Evil Dead, but that's something that's very big in the Evil Dead movies. It's like there's a lot of stuff that's just kind of gross in like a fun, over the top way. How strong your stomach is kind of determines how you feel about that part of it. But I definitely think that, especially with the examples I pointed out, like, that is there, but also like that's not necessarily what he's interested in, entirely. I think he put it there and he definitely wanted to say it, but he didn't want the movie itself to be thematically focused, if that makes sense. He wanted,
I think
like,
that's
this was still a very fun exercise in, like, I think this would be a cool idea for a movie. I want to write and make this. And, there's layers to it, but the layers themselves are not necessarily what you want to highlight, which is why we don't necessarily get very specific character stuff on even our protagonist. But oddly enough, we do get a lot of stuff from, like, the side characters that kind of fits in with the themes I was talking about. Like, especially, weirdly, there's a lot more stuff with Justin Long's family than with Christine's. Like, we only get a little bit of a hint of, like, what Christine's backstory really is, with the whole, she was overweight when she was younger, which I'm sure has led to a lot of, like, her own, like, the way that she's gone about, like, being accepted in this job and things like that. Sort of like this path to success that she's trying to get on.
I think that's all stuff you are kind of left to assume as an audience member, though. I think there's very insufficient textual evidence there. Not to completely refute your point, Sam Raimi didn't do the work there to... I can't be sold on that as his intention.
But there's enough there that I definitely did pick up on it. Since I was able to fill that in, it didn't miss as much for me as I think maybe it did for you.
Yeah, and granted, this is a rewatch for you, so, like, it's not something I was paying attention to at all going into this. I think also maybe I was treating this a little unfairly in just... Once I kind of, like, thought of my topic of like this is generic, I kind of started viewing it through that lens and taking everything else in bad faith. And I still stand by a lot of that, but maybe I did go in with a little bit too much of a negative disposition and was too quick to dismiss some of what you're saying here. Maybe a rewatch would help me see more of what you're saying. And I do see a lot of it. So I'm not trying to cheapen your point.
Giving it time too, because that's the whole key with it. Because like I watched this movie last year. I don't remember exactly when, but then I hadn't watched it since then until I got here. So it's been at minimum like 10 months since I've seen this movie. So I had the distance to like I liked it before, but I didn't notice this stuff the first time I watched it. So I think there's a certain degree of like a rewatch does help with a lot of that. And I was thinking about this the other day because I'm watching something about Tenet, which we've talked about off camera, where we disagree on it kind of in the opposite way, where I really don't like Tenet and you like it a decent amount at the very least.
It might be top
And
10 for me.
yeah,
Jesus
exactly. Like,
Christ.
and for me, that's kind of what this is to an extent. I definitely, it's not as top 10 as it was for me the first time I saw it this time, because we've talked about like a lot of the generic stuff, the stuff that wasn't working. But that's where I'm at with Tenet, where you're at with this, where I'm like, I was just like highly disappointed and like
We
the
Eldorado'd
fact,
him,
the what?
Evan. We Eldorado'd him.
We might have, yeah. For context, Angel, earlier this year, I picked El Dorado, and I was like, oh, this is going into it. Like, this is a pretty solid movie. And throughout the episode, Jelani was like, yeah, this doesn't make sense. I was like, oh, yeah, I guess you're right. That doesn't make sense. Yeah, I guess you're right about that too. Okay, maybe I just have nostalgia, and that's it. Was kind of where I landed by the end. Sorry, that's just context for what Jelani was saying there.
No, that's fair. That's fair. And I mean,
And that's okay.
I also
like, if you
yeah.
also Tenet is really flawed. I love it. I can't blame anyone for not liking it because there are a lot of distancing things in it.
You know what's not flawed? Shark Tale.
Shark
That's
Tale.
true.
Yeah.
You're describing it as body horror, and I'm not sure body horror is the right term, because when I think body
I
horror,
don't love the
I
term
think
either in this context, because I was trying to think if it was even body horror. To
it's
be
like
honest with
gross
you.
out
Yeah.
horror in quotes. It's I don't want to say gross out humor because that's meant to be
Yeah.
funny, but it's
But
like
it's more like horror where the body happens to be very involved. Like there's a lot of bodily fluids. There's a lot of like there's not as much
Right.
blood.
I think
but
they're
there's a little
adjacent.
blood. Yeah.
right. When I think body horror, I think like The Thing or The Fly.
Yeah, exactly. And it's very effective in those.
Right. It makes me wonder what happens if Sam Raimi were to lean into the body horror side, like not taking it like a comedy, like leaning into the horror side of body horror. How effective? Because I haven't seen Evil Dead, so I don't know how effective it is in those. How effective that could be as far as like bringing out the scary in this, because this could have been a lot scarier than it was.
Sure.
But it was just jump scares. And
I didn't even feel
Fisting.
like they were jump scares. It felt like it was
Not
more
even
just trying
no.
to be
There's
like,
not so
"Ah,"
oddly. There's not a lot of jump
scary-looking
scares in
things.
this.
it's like a haunted house.
Yeah. The scariest like image I think was the goat face. The possessed goat face just looks like that's just a cursed image.
That was going to be my background, because that
That
image
was
kept
so.
popping up.
Honestly, I love that so much this time around. I'm looking at it and I thought it was so funny, but in like the best way.
I don't
Like
like
it didn't
looking
pull
at
me
it.
out of it. It didn't make me. It was just so hilarious. I loved it
I
so
don't
much.
like looking at it.
I don't. It's like
No one
Uncanny
does,
Valley.
but that's the whole point.
I saw the thumbnail that used as a thumbnail for like a lot of videos about this because I went and rewatched the Anvil clip and that just showed up a lot in the search and I don't like that goat. I'm a fan of goats in general. They're fine. They're cool. But not that goat.
I did like the part where he's sort of dancing in the air. The very much just like the devil having a good time, where he's like
Oh.
dancing in the air, things are on fire, his face is all weird, and he's like yelling at them. And I like it that it's as simple as like he missed the goat because you put the guy who had the machete on the opposite side of the table, which doesn't make any goddamn sense.
movie at
As
the
I'm
moment.
watching it, I'm like
Yeah.
realizing like, wait a minute, you gave him the worst spot to be in. Like that doesn't make sense. Why is he so far away from the goat? Just have him sit behind the goat. You don't need to be around the table. It doesn't matter.
I like when it's woven into the theme of the movie or the themes of the movies better than it was here, because until you brought it across, I didn't even connect the dots on the apathy thing. And like Evan said, I'm not even sure that's what Sam Raimi was going for as far as the apathy connection between the gross out and the theme of it across the whole movie. I think it definitely could have been done better interwoven throughout the movie, and just scarier in general, because I've seen, I don't know if people know how to label this as a horror or horror comedy. I think most people see it as a horror comedy, but when you look it up, it just says
Hmm.
supernatural horror. So, yeah, and things like The Fly and The Thing, like, that's better interwoven into the body horror, because The Thing is like, you don't know who to trust. The Fly is, I think it's about hubris, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just like
Yeah,
mutation
very much about hubris.
Yeah.
taken
Yeah.
to extreme and hubris, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, like your reading here, Angel, is I think it's a fair reading to give this from an audience perspective, but it is a case where I don't think it was intentional. And there's other stories that I think you can do that with. I think it's a fine way to read this movie. It would be better if Sam Raimi had maybe gone in with that intention. Maybe he could have.
If that had been his primary focus, I
Yeah.
think is
Like I
kind of
don't
because that's where I think that gap is coming in.
I don't want to say it's entirely accidental, but it might be. There's enough doubt in my mind that like the connections you're drawing here might have just been kind of a thing that he stumbled upon and didn't even realize. But that's not to say it's not there. It's there.
Kind of like Jordan Peele and the scene from Get Out where she's separating the colored cereal from the white milk. People read it into it as that. But it's art, so you can interpret it any way you
You
want.
could do, yeah.
There's
But
no wrong answers,
the
really.
thing about Get Out is almost every other thing in that movie has thematic significance. The fact
Oh
that he
yeah.
stumbled into that is like there's so much you can put onto that, and people pointed to it. If you take that cereal scene or something like it and put it into this movie, people are just like, oh, that's weird that she eats cereal one piece at a time. In that movie, it's like it is so about theme that's immediately where people's mind are going to.
Are you saying Get Out is better than Drag Me to Hell, Evan?
You know what? I think it's a hot take, but I think I am.
And I think that the gap that's coming in is where it's sort of like what we were already talking about, where it's like because the actual way that the horror is executed is not tying into the character or her decisions, and it feels like a lot of generic placeholder horror, like, the shadow coming in and then pushing her and hitting her and throwing
Oh,
stuff all
that's
around the
another
room.
thing. There's a lot of comedy in the way they're just getting beat up by invisible
I
stuff. And
know.
the
How is she
sound
still
effects.
standing after she gets thrown into a fucking cabinet?
That's we
It's
gotta talk about that.
crazy. And this is like a ragdoll effect that happens with a lot of characters, especially in Sam Raimi stuff too, where it's like, and in something like Spider-Man, it makes sense because he's got like the healing factor a little bit or whatever. He's a
Yeah.
superhero. He can get the shit kicked out of him and he'll still be moving and doing stuff, right?
Yeah.
But oh my God, it's
Evan, we were
just
talking about we forgot to mention people getting beat up by invisible stuff. That was hilarious.
That was hilarious. That's my first
that was
note.
pretty funny.
Is just invisible slaps are funny.
I think the elements are there, and I do think that to an extent they were intentionally put there, but they're not at all being focused on, and I think that's part of the issue. But a big part of it is like it would have been effective had the way that the haunting or the sort of curse was executed, the way it's done, it's not being tied into the character or the decisions that she's made. It's just kind of very generic placeholder horror of like her getting thrown around the room like a rag doll, like a shadow coming in and pushing her and like being scary. And that could work for something like those parts almost felt like separate short films to me
Mm.
in
Yeah.
some ways. And that they would have been really cool and effective exercises of like doing that. but because they don't tie into his other stuff, it almost makes it feel like it's very easy to miss the reading that I had. I almost wonder what it would have been like, and I don't love looking at movies now where I'm like, oh, well, it would have been better if they'd done this, because the fact is, like, they didn't do that. They did something else, and I
I
don't
think that's
necessarily think it's
important to
always
look at
helpful.
them like that for
Sure.
writing purposes, though, because that's kind of, if you look at it like an early draft.
Exactly, yeah. And that's what I was saying before, too. Like, this also feels like those elements of it feel like a very early draft thing. And, but imagine a case where it's like the woman was like very sick and kind of deteriorating when she met her until she became like an MMA fighter during the car brawl or
Yes.
whatever, which is pretty cool.
She ain't that
Yeah.
damn sick if she could do that.
Imagine if this movie had been like some of the horror elements were Christine physically deteriorating in the same way. Like that was part of the curse. Like you're gonna
That
die
would
in
be
three
cool.
days, but before that, you're gonna feel all of the things that I'm feeling that you clearly don't care about because you made this one decision, which we know isn't necessarily true. Going back to Christine didn't really deserve the way that this happened to her,
That'd
right?
be
But
something.
imagine like that element of it where it's like, again, that would have been like actual body horror where we're seeing the protagonist physically deteriorate in the same way.
I mean, we see it when she's dragged towards the end with their face, but like, if we would have gotten that over the course of the movie, that would have been crazy.
But that was like that one moment, and that's such a cool moment. A lot of that moment for me was cool because of the way the twist was set up, and also like just the visceral design of the way that she was being dragged to hell. And it made me appreciate like the poster, which is currently audience you can see behind Evan, because it literally is foreshadowing the way the movie's going to end because that's kind of what she looks like.
It's a good
You know,
poster, too. I will give
it's
it
a
that.
good
That's a
poster.
really good
It's a good
poster.
poster. Yeah, especially like you have to get to the end to see just how good it is. It's what happens. And again, the ending is so cool and so well designed, but also the body horror stuff that I was talking about had, I think it would have been more effective had that stuff, been part of the nature of the curse. Because I realized watching it this time, I didn't really understand the nature of the curse. I honestly forgot that it was even 3 days.
What if she
You know,
like would have lost her house too? That could have added to it.
Yeah, there could at least be
yeah,
like parallels to do, like taste of her own medicine type of deal.
Yeah, I think in this Christine doesn't really have a character arc, but I think it's not designed for that. Because again, I think it ties into she's in a shitty situation, she did a shitty thing to somebody else in a shitty situation, and she didn't really deserve this. So you can't really execute the typical character arc that you'd think of where it's like, well, she needs to learn to have more empathy for people. Because she already kind of did have empathy for people. She just chose to ignore that specifically because this was something that she felt like she had to do for her own
There's too much
success.
ambiguity with it, I think.
There's a lot of ambiguity, which is I think part of the problem. That's just how I read it.
I don't think the stuff we're suggesting as far as like the deteriorating would have like made this movie more enjoyable to watch though. Like I
I
think
agree.
if you were to do that, you'd have to make her unlikable. Because watching that happen to like a
To
good
this version,
person,
absolutely. Yeah.
that just like make me feel bad the entire time I'm watching the movie. Like, okay, this movie's still not even scary really. Now I'm just watching these horrible things happen to this okay person that made one bad decision. I don't like that.
Exactly. You would have
And she
needed it
still
to
didn't
be a
deserve the
case
ending.
where she was already a little bit of an unempathetic person,
Right.
and she needed to have this character arc of like learning her lesson or whatever.
There's no clear flaw for her at the beginning. Like that's something that Sam Raimi does not take from like screenwriting one. Maybe that's actually
Yeah.
in two. Is like for all of his like perfect Blake Snyder beat sheets, he doesn't make good character arcs.
In Spider-Man, before the bite, his flaw was being nerdy.
Yeah. Who am I? You sure you want to know?
No, please don't.
I mean, we had to get something in somewhere. We're
He
pretty
started this
restrained
monologue
today.
at the end of the movie too.
Hmm.
He's like
Who
at
am I?
instead of paying attention during Norman's funeral, he's doing this monologue for us. And then it ends at the end of the movie. That's my takeaway.
This is my curse, my problem. Who am I? I missed the part where that's my problem.
And then Harry leans over. It's like, Peter, my father died. Shut the fuck up.
All right, are we ready to move into the takeaways?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Why don't we go in the order of the episodes? So, Jelani, what's your takeaway from these 3 episodes?
Know the identity of your movie. Know who it should be for. It's mainly what I got from Megan. But also, in the same vein of this and Megan, pick a lane with your protagonists as far as what you're trying to accomplish with them. Because remember, in Megan, we didn't care for either one of them. Either one of the protagonists. What was her name? The little girl. It was Gemma and
Katie.
Katie. Pick a lane. Now, if you swap protagonists and Gemma was the one in this movie as the loan officer, no, she still wouldn't deserve it.
Yeah, but I think they
No,
do
I don't
make
think
her.
so.
I think they kind of have the same problem. Is like they can't decide if they want us to empathize with them or not. They flip flop too much.
I feel like I said this last year too, but it applies to the movies we watched this year too. Be scary. Be scary. I look forward. It's our fault because of the movies we're picking. And Evan's not a horror buff. He's only seen a certain number of horror movies.
Yeah.
But be scary in some shape or form. In these 2 years we've done this, in the 6 films, I have not been scared once by any of these horror movies. What did David pick last year?
Exorcist.
Was it Texas? Oh, it was... Oh, my gosh. And what did you pick?
Nope.
No. Oh.
Both are good choices, just from the movie perspective.
As movies.
But
As
horror
movies,
movies.
but horror,
we
no.
did discuss.
We haven't done anything actually scary yet. Well, Final Destination scared me.
To tie it back to the first episode, I think we're all Kyle, who doesn't even think it's that scary.
Oh my god. So none of these movies were actually scary. I thought Drag Me to Hell would get me because I don't like ghost/demon horror, but nah.
I'll pick a scary or ghosty one next time. Or I'll try to.
You can.
None of these scare me, so I can't tell.
Yeah.
I'm a horror guy, so none of them scare me anymore, which is part of the problem with picking a scary one.
I mean, the movies that actually scare me are not horror movies, and they're just latter-day Adam McKay. Don't Look Up is a scary movie to me. The Boondocks episode where Jasmine has the lemonade stand, that disturbs me very deeply. But they're not horror movies, so I'm not going to do... Also, I don't want to rewatch them because they upset me, deep in my soul.
Yeah, he's just a realist when it comes to his horror, his scares.
I feel that.
I don't know. It doesn't do it for me. I don't know what it is about me. I'm not trying to be like that 13-year-old. It doesn't scare me.
Okay, Kyle.
I can't, even my other picks that I was thinking about, there's some imagery in, Black Swan that I find kind of upsetting, but it's not,
But it's not scary.
It's just I want to go cut my nails now. Yeah.
It's cringy, but in the sense of, it makes you, physically, itchy, right? It's not, it's not cringy in the same way that, Kyle is cringy. Mm-hmm. It's different cringy.
It's a different cringe. Am I good to move to my takeaway?
Yeah, I didn't have any.
Yeah.
So this actually could kind of be a takeaway from the past 6 episodes. Respect your characters. I think we've been talking about it throughout these 3 episodes, and even back to Godzilla and the Boys, and even kind of Baby Driver. Even if they're not the main focus, writing your characters with some degree of empathy and respect is going to help your story in the long run. And I think this is great evidence, and Megan as well. They're both good evidence that when you don't do that, it cheapens your story. Even if they're not going to be super deep or characters that you build out their entire backstory, when you're coming up with it, I think if you think of them as fully realized people, it does pay off.
You would think it'd be more commonplace because character and plot, those are the 2 things that make story.
Yeah, from a writing perspective, that's what you have control of at that stage.
Right.
Well, I think it's kind of what you were saying, Evan, where it's like, and I disagree about Sam Raimi doing this a lot, but I do think that like there is a degree to which like the first thing in screenwriting that people do that tends to be like a crutch is like leaning on plot because in a way it's easier, because you have a lot of those
Hmm.
plot structures set up, right? Whereas like character stuff, you kind of need to make us care, and it's a little more complicated than just like, pushing the right buttons.
It's definitely the harder task.
Yeah. And getting the two of them together, it's not as hard as people think, but I think that they think you need to almost like pick one, and you don't. Like, if you start from character, the plot will come after that.
Character is, well, I'm not gonna say it's easier, but if you start with character, you'll have an easier time in the long run.
I
Yeah,
think
in the long run, especially when it comes to rewrites and things like that. Like, you can get a movie out there technically starting from the plot stuff and doing all the beats and things like that. But then you're going at it from like, well, if the character stuff isn't there, I now need to insert that, which in turn makes it harder.
Yeah, you would think it would happen more often, but also some writers might just be leaving it up to the actors.
yeah.
Because
But I think this is good evidence of like I didn't mention this, but I was thinking about the responsibility that the actors have in this movie. Alison Lohman is working at a huge disadvantage here. Like there's a few
Yeah,
that switch in the diner where she like is a jerk to the waitress. How do you play that naturally? She has nothing to go off of. There's no internal like this isn't who this character is at her core. She's just randomly having a Karen moment.
yeah, there's no evidence of that prior to.
there's no evidence of her treating people shitty because she's frustrated, which is a very common character trait, but she doesn't feel like that character,
And
you
that
know?
moment is very much written like it's too aggressive. The way it's written is like
Mm-hmm.
this isn't just I'm having a rough day and I'm lashing out. Like she sometimes there's this even happens like in animated movies where like a character might lash out. There's a moment in Beauty and the Beast, the animated one, where the Beast like throws Belle out of the West Tower wherever she's not supposed to go, and then he kind of has this look like I wish that was too much. I wish I hadn't done that.
I shouldn't
We
have
don't
done
even
that. The
get
movie's not
that.
over.
I think that is not on Alison Lohman to give us that moment. Maybe she did, and they cut it out in post. That's something I work with a little as an editor is like you can kind of help craft a performance. I mentioned this a little in the Split episode, but like even if she gave that moment, that is ultimately Sam Raimi's decision to make her look good, and he's kind of making her look
Mm-hmm.
bad. I've said this again about his Spider-Man trilogy. I saw Kirsten Dunst in Civil War this year, and I was like, oh, she's
I
actually
just
good.
watched that too.
Like she gives a solid performance in that, and I
She's
realized,
good when she's given the right stuff to work with,
and Sam Raimi
honestly.
gives her nothing, which is why I kind of think of her as not a great actor because that's most of my exposure to her, and it's really too bad because I don't think that's his intention, but I think it is the result. People hate on Tobey Maguire in those movies. I think he's proven himself to be better than that. And, it's fun. I don't feel bad about making Bully Maguire memes. Like, they're fantastic. The reason they exist, though, is because of how Sam Raimi crafts these characters, and he's doing it with a real lack of respect. And I think just across all of these, why Split works the best for me out of these is largely James McAvoy. But like we talked about in that episode, he is given so much to work with that the actors in Drag Me to Hell and Megan are not. And that just comes from the first step of that is just write your characters with respect. I think it'll show. And it's something I want to do better. Sometimes I go in to writing characters thinking a little too much about function and not thinking of them as much as like fully realized people. And I want to try to do that more. That's my lesson.
I feel that. I do a little bit of the same thing, and I understand. I feel like it's a very normal early draft thing where, again, you're kind of leaning on plot by accident in some
It
ways
takes
too, where it's
time
like you want.
to figure
Yeah,
out
and you're
characters
also taught in
sometimes.
school that like every character has to have a function. You can't, and like to an extent that's true, but also to an extent like it's more to weed out I feel like it as I'm writing more, you realize it's more to weed out the characters that you're not executing very well because they don't really have a place in the story. And maybe they have a place in a different story that you're telling. But you can't look at it as like, well, I only need to create characters that have a specific function first.
Hmm. Ultimately, sometimes I've done that where I like have maybe a couple extra supporting characters in an early draft, and then I realized maybe actually I should combine these two or cut this one out. They don't really fit here. That's where I kind of sympathize with Sam Raimi because it is difficult. I also think it's necessary.
I agree with you on Alison Lohman. I actually was thinking about it this time. She's good. She's good in this. I haven't seen her in anything else that I can remember off the top of my head, but like she has a lot to do, and I think for the most part she does a pretty good job.
Yeah, but she's working at a disadvantage.
Yeah, she's at a disadvantage. I don't think at all that this feels like a role that's out of her league or anything. I think she's fully capable of doing this, but everything that needs to happen for her to be set up for success is not necessarily there. And Jelani, I know you were talking to us about this. I don't remember if it was on air or off air, but it was basically like it's become clear that like a lot of directors like don't like their primary thing is not to work with the actors. Like they'll sit there and they'll trust the actor to kind of do their thing, which is like I know from what you described and what I remember from school, that was the exact opposite of what I was taught. When I was on set directing, my main job was basically like I did have to work with the rest of the crew a lot, but a lot of what I focused on was like working with the actors. That's part of why I love directing. Is like you want to work with the actors to get the best performance, and you also have to work with other people. But that's like the primary job of the director is to get the best performances out, at least in my experience. And apparently that's not real life. Like that's not the way that it happens.
Angel, what's your lesson for this or your takeaway?
My takeaway is honestly like it's somewhat similar to yours, I guess, where it's like you were talking about characters. For me, it's the horror works the best when it's as personal as possible. Like I would agree that the best of these three, even though Drag Me to Hell was my pick, obviously, I think Split was the best of the three. And I think that the reason for that is that, like, and we were talking about a lot in the last episode, we really came to empathize with Kevin and the 25 other people that live in his head. Like the other characters too, like the more personal the horror got, like the more tight that it felt as far as like the execution, like when it got down to like the most personal level and it was like these little everyday anxieties almost. When you get down to the nitty gritty of that, that is the most effective, which is why certain things in like this movie, for example, there was a little bit of a gap because they're a little too over the top, a little too like style for style's sake. And even in Megan too, there were a couple of moments like that where they're like, "We're just gonna have fun with this," which is fine.
Hmm.
But
Yeah, kind of what
like
we
you were
talked about,
saying,
like
we
the
didn't.
camp taking away from the horror in that. I think that was
Yeah,
that
I was
your
considering
topic, Jelani?
making that a topic.
the
Well,
campness. Yeah, like
what is campiness? That's what was going to be my topic for this, and I realized that before, well, after I texted chat my actual topic.
I think that there's better movies to talk about campiness as a topic. Like,
Yeah. This felt like cheese rather than camp to me, if we can make that distinction.
yeah, I know what you mean. Like, camp, I think, also has a certain degree of intention, and I think we talked about a lot how, like, we didn't understand the intention as far as, like, character and theme and plot went as much in this as we would in something, as much as you guys are ragging on Spider-Man. Like, we understand a lot of the intentions in each of those things. Like, I can follow the logic of how that movie happened, like how that
The
movie's going
character
on
motivations are
thematically and
tighter
like
there.
character wise. Yeah, it makes sense to me. So like, and the little funny bits in those movies, like Punch Me I Bleed, or like all the Willem Dafoe stuff. That's camp, and all of it works really well in that for that reason. Whereas this, especially the gross stuff, it did feel a little cheesy, which is it's a different thing.
This did make me appreciate J.K. Simmons and Willem Dafoe's performances a little more, because I think I realized that like when you're working with Raimi level character work, I was kind of saying this before, it's like incumbent upon the actors to fill in the rest of that, and I think they are the two most skilled actors in
J.K.
that
Simmons is so good.
trilogy, and they do their thing. They
My son, the astronaut.
deliciousness, as we dubbed him,
Oh yeah, the delicious.
the delicious
Oh,
John Jameson
So
Jr.
gross. There's so many contexts in which that word is disgusting, and that was one of them. It makes me cringe every time, but it's also so funny.
You're delicious. I'm on the moon again. Are
oh,
you
I'm
there
on
with
the
me?
moon
again.
again.
Are we good to move to the boilerplate? We all set?
Yeah.
I would say so, yeah. This was fun,
Okay.
though. I liked doing the horror.
Yeah. I think we should do this with a different genre as well at some point.
Christmas.
Especially because
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to run out of horror movies to do pretty quick. If we
You
keep
got to
doing
start
this.
watching some on your own.
I have. I've
I'm
done a
not.
couple. I did Midsummer
I have
this
so many
year.
horror movies that we could watch, honestly.
I'm pretty limited in my amount. I think I could do maybe 3 more, and one of them might have to be a Scooby-Doo movie.
Okay, that's not. We're not doing
That's-
that.
Yes,
I'm
we
already
are.
omitting that. I'm omitting that from the horror movie thing. You
Which
gotta
Scooby-Doo
do
movie
something.
is it, though?
Probably
The-
the
the
Witch's
tr-
Ghost.
No.
Or
Yes!
Cyber Chase, one of those two. Those are the ones I
The
watched
track
as a
record
kid.
of these, we gotta start doing. Like next year should be the horror, the scariest. Well, scariest for Evan. Scariest stuff we know. Like we can't do.
Maybe I'll
Scooby-Doo
make you
next
watch
year, bro.
Midsummer then, because I do like that. I finally watched it a couple months ago.
Something. Because
Midsummer grew on me so much. I love it now. I hated it the first time I saw it.
I just thought it was really well shot. I don't know if I vibe with it beyond that, but like it's just pretty enough that I gave it 4 stars. And Florence Pugh's excellent, and she gives a really solid performance.
wasn't that her breakout?
Yeah, I'd say so. Like that whole
Yeah,
year
yeah, it was.
between that, Little Women, and Fighting with My Family was all that year.
Well, now she's in the MCU as
Yeah.
young
As the best MCU character.
White Widow. She's in my
Yeah.
top 3.
I love her so much. She's so good.
I haven't seen any of the MCU stuff she's in because I've heard it's all bad.
Thunderbolts is coming out. That looks fun.
I really liked Black Widow. I know a lot of people didn't. I thought it was pretty good. It should have come way earlier.
Anyway, let's move to the boilerplate. Our next 2 episodes, we're doing Snowpiercer as Jelani's next pick, and my next pick is Interstellar. So 2 sci-fi movies.
No, we have Sunshine too.
Oh yeah, also I forgot. So I also have my next pick. It's gonna be Sunshine. We're kind of now. I realized like you guys had 2 big sci-fi movies that I love, and I thought I keep with the sci-fi theme. So Sunshine's really good, and you guys hadn't seen it. You guys haven't seen it, so
Maybe we'll call that a trilogy too. Then we'll just make it accidental sci-fi.
accidental double trilogies.
Trilogy. Yeah. Okay, so we'll be doing those 3. We have our YouTube channel with all the podcasts, video essays, and now ranking videos. If you're there already, like, share, and subscribe. If you're on Spotify, leave us a rating and review. That always helps. We've got our Discord that you can join for free and make suggestions and just become part of the fan community. We also have our Patreon, which has much more of me and Jelani talking about our thoughts on Sam Raimi from a few years ago. We are at varying levels of intoxication throughout those episodes, so we're not at our most coherent, I guess. We're not incoherent, but we're certainly not at the top of our game analytically. They are a lot of fun, though. And we've got a lot of watch-alongs and other bonus episodes on the Patreon. We're going to be... I think our next thing we're going to do before Snowpiercer and Interstellar, we want to try to do a Shark Tale watch-along, which is... That's going to be a good time, I think.
The highlight of cinema.
Martin Scorsese and Will Smith teaming up. What could be better?
Nothing.
Nothing.
Nothing at all.
Maybe a whale wash.
Maybe a whale wash. And the price. Oh my gosh. And in other news, the channel now has an Instagram, thanks to Angel. What's our handle?
Yes. Our handle is @intanalysisPod. So yeah, all just one word. But we have just started it today, actually, on the day of recording, and so we'll be posting there pretty regularly, I hope. With channel updates, I'll try to drop in like little creative posts here and there too, but we're going to be announcing episodes there, linking to other stuff. If you can, follow so you can get all of our updates, that would be great.
I'll put a link to that in the description. I am on Letterboxd at ev_wes. I'll also plug my Instagram for once at evwestman. This is only a few hours old. I'm finally going to actually post something there because I finally, completely unrelated, hit my first ace in disc golf today. So I'm going to put up a couple pictures of that because that's been a long time coming. I can't promise there will be much more there to follow.
It's just the Halloween post, right? From last year?
Yeah,
it's just
that's
the Halloween one?
That's the only thing I've ever put on there. Yeah. Where are you guys at?
I'm on Instagram at Jelani T. Kelly. YouTube, Jelani T. Kelly. Actors Access, Jelani T. Kelly.
I'm on Instagram at AngelsArc15. That's Arc with an H. And I'm on Letterboxd at Serenity Cinema. And now I'm also on our Interior Analysis Pod Instagram. So you can find me there also, and find all of us there.
We are all there. The final thing, just because of when this is probably going to drop, please vote. And please vote to not have fascists in office, whatever that means for where you live.
No fascists, please. And we all know who we're talking about.
Well, we know who we're talking about broadly within whatever local elections you have. I don't know about that, like, for our listeners, but I think if anyone's been here long enough, you know what we're not fans of. So get out the vote, and we'll see you next time.